Welcome to OSDU Data Platform Application Developer Training, Authorization Module. If you are going to use an application that makes requests to any OSDU endpoint, the first step for the application will be to authorize the user. So before exploring the core services, you should learn how to perform authorization in the OSDU Data Platform. The platform uses the OpenID Connect standard to provide information about the user for OSDU services. The OpenID Connect standard provides multiple ways to authorize a user, but we are going to show how to pass authorization process in the most popular way, the OAuth 2.0. Typically, OAuth 2.0 authorization code flow is used for web applications where there is a two-stage authorization, for a user and for the application. The basic concept of the OpenID Connect standard is identifying and verifying an end user by the identity provider. The identity provider is not part of the OSDU platform and typically depends on the cloud provider. So, before making any request, you should authorize. Let's say there is a web application that communicates with an OSDU service. This application is called the client. The client requests the user to pass the authorization procedure. By using the OpenID Connect standard, the client gets information about the user from the identity provider. It uses information provided by the user to the client after the sign-in process. First, the user signs in with ID and password. For this purpose, the identity provider has a special authorized endpoint. So the user gets ID token and authorization code. The default format of token is JSON Web Token, or JWT, and then the authorization code is sent to the client. Authorization code is used by the application to request access token. The client uses token endpoint for this purpose. And access token is used to authorize the user in the system. We will talk about this in other module. The internal authorization is performed by the entitlement service. An access token stores a set of information about the user and the client. Information about the user is also stored in the token, but there is no need to use it since that info is also located in access token along with the client's info. And you should attach this token to each request for OSDU. Using this token, the entitlement service identifies who is making the request and provides information about the data and services available for this user. This is possible because the entitlement service gets information by decoding access token. Here you can see my access token on the left side and the decoded version on the right side. So here there is an app ID, this is the client ID, and some other information. So before starting, you should register your application with the identity provider. Typically, you provide some information to the OSDU instance or a cloud administrator in your organization. One of the parameters is redirect URL. This is the endpoint that will be listening for the information returned from the identity provider. The cloud administrator will give you client ID and client secret. These are the credentials that your application, the client, will be using for client authentication. In the authorization request, the client also provides a set of information. Client ID helps the authorization server to authenticate the client. The request should also contain redirect URL. You can also call it callback. The response type is information the client expects. In this case, we use type code. The scopes are a list of required permissions for a client. To start authorization process, OpenID and email are enough, but other scopes also might be useful. Now, let's try to reproduce the authorization process in Postman. Here, we have a list of empty parameters in our environment, and our goal is to fill access and refresh token with valid values. During the authorization process, we will also get out token URL and out authorized URL. The first request I'm going to show you is OpenID Connect Discovery. Your OSDU or Cloud Administrator should provide this URL for you. Note that the URL has a client ID as an optional parameter. This is the preferable way to call this request. OpenID Connect Discovery provides you useful information such as token, an authorized endpoint, scopes, support, etc. From this request, we have got authorization endpoint and token endpoint. So we have field out and token URL in our environment. In the response, you can also find the scopes and claims supported by the identity provider. The next step is the authorized procedure. You need to navigate to the authorization tab. Then I am choosing the OAuth 2.0 type because OpenID Connect is a layer on top of the OAuth 2.0 protocol. The difference between these two standards is that OpenID Connect provides identity information to the client. I have already filled the configuration with the required parameters, but the first time you will need to do it manually. Callback URL is the same as redirect URL. Auth URL and access token URL we got from discovery URL. Client ID and client secret came from the cloud administrator. Scope is filled with OpenID profile, offline access, and the last value, specific for Azure provider, allows to get user information. Now, I'm going to authorize with credentials. So you probably know your credentials. Typically, they may be those you use in your organization. Here, we have the output, but all you need is to save refresh token from the result and store it in the environment variables. I can also save access token from the authorization result, but I will get it again by refresh token. We don't need this authorization process for now. It automatically puts access token to the header, but I'm going to add it manually to the request. Let's try to get new access token. I should put refresh token as well as a credential in the body. The response holds a set of information such as token type, scope, access ID, refresh token. Also, here's expiration time. It means that we can use this token during this period of time. In the test, I save access token and ID token to the environment. Now let's try to make a request to an OSDU service. As I mentioned before, the entitlement service provides a list of privileges for a user in the OSDU platform. Each user is a member of one or several groups. Let's try to get a list of groups. For this purpose, I have filled the authorization header with access token. I have specified the type of this token before it. The next header, data partition ID, defines the workspace for your request. You can think of it as about isolated emp in OSDU. Your OSDU admin should provide the name of your partition. So the entitlement service returned the list of my groups. Keep in mind that access token will expire. Let's wait some time till the token expiration. So if we make a request after token expiration, we will get 401 response code, and JOT expired answer. JOT is our access token. In this case, you should go to refresh your token request to get a new access token. So let's try to make a request one more time. In the Data Lifecycle Lab, you will learn how to build your own application and how to implement the OSDU authorization flow.